We should get going. It is Friday afternoon. Welcome to the closing panel, which is the really big picture panel. What can we expect the financial system to look like, or at least elements of it, in 2025? Several of the panelists here to my right, I won't say who, complained about that topic, but they've all game to at least give it a shot. No long introductions, since I think many of them are already known to you, but we'll start with Peter Fisher from the Tufts School of Business at Dartmouth, Jingdong Hua, the treasurer of the IFC, Tomas Philippon, professor of finance at NYU, and last but not least, Adam Posen, the president of the Peterson Institute. So, Peter, all yours.
Thank you, Trish. Let me talk more about how we will feel about the financial system in 2025, but I want to take the mandate seriously. And let me, first, a note of caution about what I think I'm saying and what I'm not saying. Second, a note of caution about be careful who you call a populist. And then I'd like to talk a little about what is financial innovation in historical context and what is it today. So I want to be very clear what I'm saying and not saying. I don't want to repeat all the wisdom that came before us today, which was considerable, and I don't mean to speak in opposition to it either. I mean that there was a lot of great thoughts, and I really want to congratulate Franklin and Trish for bringing together so many different views and yet having us find a strand and keep informing each other. So I'm not opposing, but I do want to press us all to think more deeply and more elementally about these awkward subjects, which I want to summarize that we're much more sophisticated than this. We're so sophisticated we lose sight of when we're debating whether we have too much finance or too little. A central banker trying to promote growth, a development economist hoping to help an emerging market come up, and a financial sector all too willing to oblige, want to see more finance and more credit and more debt. And some others are somewhat more skeptical about that. And I think that we too quickly gloss over those very different perspectives. It's always compared to what? That's what matters. And at some point, too much debt will bind, and in some context it might not, and in others it would a lot. Now, leverage doesn't kill us, but the term structure of leverage does kill us. And that's the link between solvency and liquidity. That, again, if we're too complicated and sophisticated as financial experts, we will gloss over these distinctions. So that really is my main point, and I've said it, and now I have a few more minutes to say a few other things. Be careful who you call a populist. I mean that both as a matter of history and language and politics. If you mean that you think someone else's views are based on ignorance or bigotry or naive nationalism or misplaced anger, I suggest you say so. Calling them populists is just a gloss that here in the English language we developed in the late 19th century when we wanted to belittle the Farmers' Alliance and the People's Party, who had a monetary critique of late 19th century America, which everyone in this room accepts as conventional wisdom. Adams Institute defends these ideas today. So imagine, if you will, a patchwork quilt of exchange rates between banking systems and gold, imposing on lesser developed economies high risk premia and vast regional differences in credit conditions, which combined with a persistent deflation presented these developing economies of America's South and Prairie West with effective real interest rates in excess of 100%, as documented by C. Van Woodward years ago in his wonderful book, The Origins of the New South. Now, industrial, urban, northern United States had a very hard time with that critique. It didn't make any sense to them. So they called them populists as an insult, rabble-rousers. Now, there were rabble-rousers, and there may have been ignorance, and there may have been bigotry, but to gloss too quickly over their economic critique of monetary conditions would be a mistake. I don't pretend to understand the outsider critique of our economic and political system today, but I think we should not rest comfortably in the fact that we don't understand it. So I think we should take that very seriously and use our terms without derision. I want to give a very brief history of financial innovation of the last 5,000 years, and I want you to take seriously both parts of this. Financial innovation over the last 5,000 years has gone hand in hand with the advance of civilization, as lots of wonderful books have documented. William Gutzman at Yale's a wonderful tome, Money Changes Everything, most recently, and others as well. I want you to take seriously that something else that has happened over the last 5,000 years is that when we have encouraged those at the bottom half of the income distribution to incur high levels of debt to income, we have very rarely created a rising middle class and have with great frequency created generations of debt peons, serfs, and sharecroppers. And I challenge anyone here who disputes me to do as I have done, read the entire 2-volume Cambridge University history of capitalism.
Punishment.
I think I'm going to be safe in that. So I want you to take seriously that it's both. Financial innovation is both the promise of civilization and risks putting many humans in great jeopardy. Now, what is financial innovation today? It is faster information, faster debits and credits. It is rule arbitrage. And it may also be improvements and changes in the division of labor. And as all three of those things, it holds the promise of producing real gains in productivity, but no guarantee of that. So faster information flow may create financial inclusion, may create access to credit and debt, I would quickly point out, in the developing economies. But it might also simply be slicing and dicing the revenues which financial intermediaries extract between savers and borrowers. There's no guarantee which one it does. It can do both. And I think we should all take that very seriously. We should hope it creates great productivity gains, and we should be afraid that it's just one more device for financial services to grow its share of total corporate profits and to grow debt to income. I'll hold a test for the future of financial innovation. Will it be as profound as the advent of the mass market credit card? That is, will we be able to buy lunch based on our future labor power without promising to do the dishes? It's an extraordinary financial innovation. Thinking of that for the mass market, it was profound divisions in the changes in the division of labor, and it also kind of pumped up household debt to income. It was real, it sped up finance, and since about the time we launched the mass market credit card, here in the United States, we've seen a persistent rise in household debt to income. We peaked it out a little bit in the crisis, but if you look at a long enough history, you'll see that we're only back to the prior peaks from where we've come down to. Gary Gorton has called it the quiet period. More famously, we've called it the Great Moderation. I urge you to ponder whether it's all a great coincidence that we've had persistent declines in productivity and persistent increases in private debt to income, measured by either household income or GDP. Now, I don't know which way the causation runs, but I'm deeply skeptical it's all just a great coincidence. My suspicion is causation runs in both directions. But I urge us to think hard about when we're getting financial innovation that's really helping us reduce the inequalities of wealth and income in our societies, adding to productivity that adds to all of our benefit, and when we just are putting the financial sector on steroids. I think that's a really serious question, and I'm nervous. We'll come back in 7 years when Trish and Franklin invite us in 2025, and we'll all have a chance to sit together and see whether household debt to income is higher or lower, whether financial sector profits as a share of total corporate profits are higher or lower. And That, I think, is more important than what the institutional landscape will look like. I'm nervous about the answer. I'm hopeful, but I'm nervous. Let me stop there.
Being shown. Let me say that I'm very humbled by my fellow panelists, and your collective intellectual power and experiences are something that I cannot match. So I'll speak as a layman. As a layman, let me put it this way. In 1981, when I was a student in a Chinese university studying chemical engineering, China's GDP was 200 billion, divided by 1 billion people, so $200 per capita. And the only bond I knew back then was James Bond, because we didn't have the corporate bond or treasury bonds. Now, fast forward to now, China's GDP is $12 trillion, and China has a $10 trillion bond market. And China's infrastructure, similar to Japan before China, were essentially built by financing through bond market. So that's the correlation I would see, the positive power of finance. Yes, indeed, Japan, China may, the debt is a little higher than somebody feel comfortable, but it's after the infrastructure have been built, and we can focus on solving that issue. So that was speaking in my personal capacity. 2025 is a mere 7 years away. But if you go back to 2010, if you tell me the machine would beat a Go player, I would not believe. Because a Go game, a traditional Chinese game, a chess game that is played in Japan, Korea, and China, is so complicated that the total legal move is 10 to the 172th power, where the total particles of universe is only 10 to the 80th. But that's already done by AlphaGo. And now, if you read the latest Nature journal, you know that AlphaGo 0 has beaten AlphaGo by purely self-learning, with no input from human beings. How do we then harness that tremendous positive power of technology going forward? Just a word of advice about IFC. For those of you who don't know, we are part of the World Bank Group. Our mandate is to support private sector growth in our member countries, because without a vibrant private sector, a country would never achieve its economic potential, because private sector creates over 80–90% of the jobs. So we have 184 member countries, and they have given us a grand total of $2.6 billion seed capital, equity capital. And using our AAA credit rating, Peter, we went to capital market, we issue bonds. And what do we do with that bond? We did over $250 billion of private sector investment on commercial terms in over 120 countries, in over 6,000 projects. Now, because IFC, by definition, cannot invest more than a fifth of a project, the total catalyzed financing, thanks to IFC's intervention, has been over $1 trillion. And I just want to say this is a positive impact of finance. So I just want to tell a story. This is a picture of Dr. Jim Kim visiting Jack Ma. If you look on your left-hand side, when we went to Alibaba in June, I was there accompanying Dr. Kim. He was wearing a pair of leather shoes. Now, by the next morning, he changed into a pair of Kung Fu shoes that Jack Ma ordered for him before dinner on Taobao net, which is the Amazon of China. So within 2 hours, that pair of Kung Fu shoes was delivered. It's not just a pair of Kung Fu shoes. This is how Dr. Kim explains the transformative power of technology. That is, before internet, before e-commerce, before Alibaba created an ecosystem of well over 500 billion people in China using e-commerce, a grandma in a remote village in China who is good at making Kung Fu shoes normally would not even find the outlet to sell that pair of Kung Fu shoes. Even if she did, the meager profit, the most of it would be taken away by the middleman through the various logistics and everything. But thanks to Taobao Village, where Alibaba has set up a Wi-Fi hotspot in the village, where the grandma can create an online shop, she now can keep 80-90% of the profit. That is fighting poverty in a brand new way through technology. This is a very simplified map of global poverty as we know today. In the narrowly defined extreme poverty, which is about $1.9 a day, there are still 800 million people that fall into that category. Now, if you define it a little broadly as $3.2, it's about 2 billion people. Now, it so happens there are 2 billion people in the world that have no access to financial services. So one could make this judgment that lack of access to finance is a major impediment to fighting poverty. So, and this is where new technology through artificial intelligence, through big data, through machine learning, through what some of IC's clients have demonstrated, give us a brand new way of reaching those poor people in a much more accelerated manner. Now, let me give you very quickly 2 examples. One is in Haiti, one of the poorest countries in this, actually the poorest country in this hemisphere. We have a Haiti woman, Marie, who every day, 4 o'clock in the morning, has to take a bus to her work. Now, if she was unlucky, in the middle, she has to step down to change a bus and pay a new fare. If she has to do it every day on that, her monthly income is less than the bus fare that she has to pay. So what did we do? In the World Bank, if you look at this side, we actually use the Digicel company's data. We analyzed through cell phone communication the heat map of those people. Where are they during the day? Where are they in the evening? So to design the entire logistic or public bus system to be much more logical. So this is still pretty rudimentary using big data, but already if you look at the right-hand side, in the city center, the accessibility improvement is already over 51%. And this is the power of new technology. The second case is bKash in Bangladesh. So 40% of adults in Bangladesh has a bank account. Now, Bangladesh has 165 million people, which means tens of millions of adults don't have access to any financial services. So a client of IC, actually 2 Bangladeshi Americans, working with a local cell phone company, a local bank, launched a new online mobile phone-based financial services, just similar to the M-Pesa in Kenya. And so in 2 or 3 years, they had about 2-3 million customers. And then Bill Gates Foundation and IC decided to become equity investor. And then we shared our experiences working with Alibaba, working with M-Pesa and others. I'm very happy to say that in a short 4 or 5 years that we have been involved, the client base has become 35 million. So the network effect of a mobile system and the fact that the marginal cost of getting a new customer on board as compared to a traditional brick and mortar bank is virtually zero. And this really gives us hope that fighting poverty through mobile phones, through AI, through big data is really, really exciting going forward. This is a photo somebody took when I was in Cameroon 2 weeks ago with local students. So 25 years ago, I started my international career in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa. On weekends, I would walk to the local university because they have a big swimming pool. So I would strike up conversation with students, and you could tell because I just freshly graduated from MBA in the US, the knowledge gap of an Africa student 25 years ago with a student in the United States is quite high because you don't have online, internet, and all they have are textbook in paper. Nowadays, when I go to Africa countries, which I go 4 or 5 times a year, and I talk to university students, and I also speak at Kellogg at London School of Economics, I can tell you the kind of question that they ask are no different. Because through internet, through technology, we have a level playing field in terms of knowledge acquisition. But, as Dr. Jim Kim has said, higher knowledge base also raises expectation. So what is populism in a developing country, in Sierra Leone, in Nigeria, in Cameroon, which I visited in the last 2 or 3 weeks? It is to gain same opportunity as people in OECD country, in the United States, and in China. So, but here I just wanted to plug a word in terms of, thank you, I see it, 1 minute, about regulation. So in Kenya and in Bangladesh and in China, somehow the regulatory pace of governing new financial players using digital technology is such that the network effect allowed players to quickly reach a massive amount of people. Compare that to Nigeria, where 40 million adults don't have any access to banking services, where IFC invested in 6 microfinancing companies. The biggest one just celebrated 10 years of successful operation in Nigeria. Guess how many customers they have? A mere 160,000. Why? Because Nigeria has 1,005 central bank supervised microfinance banks, and then several thousand microfinance institutions. As they don't have scale, it's like a bad cycle. It's not a virtuous cycle. You don't have scale, you're fragmented, so your customer base is weak. Customer base is weak, you have to beef up your credit people, cost is high, non-performing loan is high, interest rate charge is high, and of course commercial banks and other investors don't want to invest in these small fragmented microfinance companies. So we need to figure out a way from a policy regulatory point of view, how do we gently encourage them into the Bangladesh model, the Chinese model, the India model, which Paytm also has over half a billion customers on their single mobile financial network. So with that, I think I have ran out of time. Thank you very much. Let me say that digital finance is a game changer for development, and I have to say I would caution, amidst all the volatility and damage finance has brought periodically, let's never forget the positive impact of finance, because entrepreneurship without finance, you never get anywhere. On the country, in the United States, 250 years ago, it's a poor agriculture country. How did the United States evolve into economically dynamic country? It's entrepreneurship. It is money always on the ready supporting that entrepreneurship. So Peter, I hope we'll have a good discussion. Thank you. And other fellow panelists.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for inviting me. So it's late and we're all tired. So I'm going to make 3 points in less than 10 minutes. Point number 1, finance is still expensive. So if you want to understand why we are talking about fintech today and why we are talking about changing the financial system, that's the first thing to understand. How do I know that? Well, because I spent 2 years measuring it. So here's the US, all right? In the green circles and the red line. The green circle is how much we pay for financial services in the US, which is the sum of every profit and wages paid to financial intermediaries and employees of financial intermediaries as a share of GDP. So it went from 2% in the late 19th century to about 8% before the crisis. And now what do we get from that? Where we get financial intermediation. So the red line measures the amount of financial intermediation in the US economy, and it's scaled in such a way that you can somehow interpret it as a credit to GDP ratio. Okay, so if all intermediation was purely, say, corporate bonds, then this would be the ratio of corporate bond to GDP. Of course, because it's more complicated than that, you have to do some kind of complicated additions, but in spirit, it's similar to that. So you can see that the two series track each other closely, and just to be clear, there's not a single underlying series which is common to the two graphs. Okay. So it's not by chance, it's not a fluke that they are on top of each other. It means that there is a deep connection there. But then if you look at the number more closely, you compare, say, 1960 to the recent period. So in 1960, we spent 4% of GDP to intermediate twice GDP. Before the crisis, we roughly spent 8% of GDP to intermediate 4 times GDP. Well, that doesn't sound like a lot of productivity gains, right? Because in both cases, if you do the ratio of how much we pay to what we get, is about 2%. In other words, the cut that finance takes out of intermediation has been 2%. And not only since the 1960s, actually, it has been 2% for more than a century. Okay. So if you want to understand why fintech is happening, I think that's the reason. Because it's hard to imagine another industry that, for instance, uses so much IT and still manages not to get more productivity gains. Okay? If you were a picture like that for retail, you would get something very different starting in 1990. Right? You would see a very sharp decrease in the retail price relative to other services because of, or thanks to IT. Now, it did not happen in finance until recently. Actually, it is happening today, finally. But if you want to understand why fintech is happening, that's it. Okay, so point number one, finance is expensive. And by the way, if you wander outside the US, here's how it looks in France, Germany, and the UK. And the bottom line is that there used to be some differences, but to a large extent, everybody's converged towards 2% today. Okay. But my point is 2% is way too high. We shouldn't be paying 200 basis points of intermediation cost. That just makes no sense. All right. So point number two is about regulation. Okay. So this is my attempt to summarize the system, where we are and where we want to be. So the system is this big dinosaur there, and which we all agree is expensive, highly levered, and too big to fail. And then the person thinking there is probably like Paul Tucker, and he's thinking about, how do we get to a better system? While Paul Tucker meets Rodin, okay, but I guess. And somehow we have a sense that maybe a better system would look like this. Okay, although I took this antelope, but it could have been anything else. The point is it might look very different from what we currently have. Okay, and then we have this little thing happening in the corner, which as of now it doesn't really matter at all. Okay, which is the fintech or evolution in finance. And so here's my assessment of what we've done so far. And what I mean is post-crisis. So what I think we've done since 2008 is we moved from this guy to this guy, which is, I don't mean that to be ironic. I think it's a big improvement, okay? Which is we've de facto reduced the danger in the system. We've made it smaller, and somehow we also figured out it's still working. Yeah. And remember back, when people started talking about maybe we should increase the equity ratio and stuff like that, so, oh no, that's going to be the end of the world. We will not have any credit anymore. And somehow we did it, and we still have some credit. So that means that this is not the only possible model. All right. Now, my point is, and I think that's consistent with what we've heard today, is this process somehow has stalled. And there are many reasons for that. but it's very unlikely to get us to the next step. So perhaps we can get there, shrinking a bit more the dinosaur, but it's unlikely that we're going to get there through that approach. Okay, so my point is that what we've done so far since the crisis has been significant, but there are good reasons, both political and economic reasons, that it's unlikely to go much further. Okay, then the third point is, what could we do? Okay, and so I think the way I like to think about it now is containment plus entry. Right? So containment, by that I mean we need something that prevents these guys from growing back, otherwise there will never be any space for the fintech mice to grow. Okay, so containment has to be, which as of today really means just trying to build the statu quo and keep it. Okay, so don't start to renege on high capital ratios or some kinds of regulation like that. And then, so that gets my proposal strategy has two prongs. One is this containment. The other one is entry and, for lack of a better word, regulated evolution, which is you let these guys enter, and then you let them evolve, and you don't pretend that you guess the stages that will get you there, right? So we don't pretend that we know what the end product is going to look like. However, it doesn't mean we shouldn't regulate. In fact, I think that you can make a reasonable case that today is probably the most critical time for regulation of fintech and of innovation in finance. Why? Because for two reasons. Standards, it's better if you set them early. Okay, so if there is something you like, or in my opinion, if there's something you don't like, then you should say it up front so that when the industry evolves, it would evolve in the right way. Prime example, money market fund. Imagine how the world would have been if in the 1970s we had said, oh, by the way, we love money market funds, great thing. Just a small footnote there, you can't offer non-floating NAV. I think at the time, people have said, okay, fine, what's the big deal, I'm going to float between 98 cents and 99 cents and nobody's going to care, right? So at that time, that would not have been a big deal. Now doing it today when the industry is 2.5 trillion, that's a much harder thing to do. So I think the same exactly applies to fintech, which is if there is something we want or we don't want, it's better if we specify it today. Now is the right time to do it. Because otherwise, and I guess that's going to echo what Peter said earlier, which I completely agree. And that's the point that, say fintech in that case, but more broadly finance, it's an opportunity, but there is no guarantee that it will evolve in the right way. There is nothing that guarantees that this guy is going to go that way. And for a very simple reason, that's not their private incentives. Their private incentives is to look like these guys. So therefore, the unregulated approach is this. That's another one for Wallace and Gromit fans like me. All right? From those who don't, this is from The Curse of the Were-Rabbit.
You have too much time on your hands.
Or many kids who like it. And it's not by chance, of course, because that's a natural thing to do, right? And that's true for fintech. Of course, it's also true for the wonderful innovation we see in a retail product. You were mentioning lots of retail. So they are great today, but there's no doubt that what they have in mind is to gain monopoly power. And in that sense, we shouldn't be naive. The fact that it's high-tech doesn't change anything to the issue of market power and things like that. Okay? So we can be enthusiastic about technology, but we should keep the very old-fashioned principles about antitrust and market concentration and competition. And if we do it, we have a chance of getting there. If we don't, we're going to go there. So that's my third point. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm one of those who doesn't have PowerPoint, which may be good or bad after. Yeah, I actually end up less graphically in much the same place as Thomas, but we'll get there. First off, let me thank Patricia Mosser, Professor Mosser, SEPA, and the Brevin Howard Center at Imperial College for including me. I unfortunately had to miss part of the morning due to my managerial responsibilities, but I'm looking forward to watching all the videos. It's clearly a very interdisciplinary and fascinating conference. And in that spirit, I want to call out Annalisa Riles in the audience, who put together a fantastic interdisciplinary conference at Cornell on central banking a year ago. I think, unlike Paul, I actually found that one to be truly interdisciplinary. So anyway, let me make my points. So I have 5, 6, 7 points, and I'll try to be as speedy as Thomas was. First thing is, we have to accept that international fragmentation is going to persist. And it goes to the famous lines about banks are maybe international, but they die at home. But it also goes to this broader populist background that I gather Secretary Liu spoke about and that Peter made reference to, and in a sense echoes in a distorted way some of what Thomas said, that ultimately economic nationalism is out there, and I'm choosing that word rather than populism because I think it's a little more apt and focused. And that usually involves national champions and national champions in banking in particular. That's not going to be monolithic, but I am not going to hold my breath for either the Chinese or the US government to essentially give up having international banks that they favor and protect. But I think it also relates to a broader economic problem or reality, which is that there is much less real convergence in the world than we generally think. And you can talk about this in terms of growth rates and the fact that basically most emerging markets have stopped converging and did so before the crisis, or that in Latin America, many major economies that did most things right by the Washington Consensus, like Chile or Mexico, did not see major improvements in productivity performance over the last 30 years and did not converge further on the US. My colleague at PIE, Jose de Gregorio, has a paper coming out on that very soon. Foreign direct investment makes some difference in terms of convergence of cultures and management and ideas, but even that doesn't seem to be very much. But financial integration has not done anything to speed convergence. So we can get into issues of what kinds of train wrecks financial flows cause, and whether Blanchard is right to call for capital controls or whether there are alternatives. But let's stick with the big picture, that for all the supposed power of financial flows and asset allocation, we have not seen greater convergence. We have not even seen finance flow the right way. That is why Jingdong and his colleagues have a job. So when we start thinking about the structure of finance in 10 years or 8 years' time, it's important, I think, to recognize that the structure of finance has not changed much as a result of the crisis, even with all the supposed overregulation, except to the degree that there's greater concentration in various countries because of particular banking systems, because as this audience doesn't need reminding, the sad reality is when you're a policymaker facing a banking crisis, you initially try to have the big and presumably safer institutions take over the ones in trouble. And so you have flight to quality of some sort, or flight to too big to fail, depending how you interpret it. But the bottom line is, in most of the advanced economy banking systems, you do have actually more concentration, more market power than you once did. And this is very important political symbolism as well as in terms of what it actually means for the functioning of markets. It's very much endogenous to politics. My esteemed younger colleague made a beautiful image of Paul Tucker, interchangeable with Rodin's thinker, facing the Brontosaurus. I think the more apt image, though, for financial regulation is Bambi meets Godzilla. If you haven't seen that clip, Google it. Bambi, Godzilla. We are already seeing the backlash.
Better go to slide.
Yeah, no, I got a few tricks.
You don't
But
need
anyway,
slides,
Google it. The cinematography is wonderful. But I mean, basically, let us be realistic. We are seeing already, through discretionary authority of the Trump administration and the new appointments coming in at the Federal Reserve, a significant change in the implementation of CCAR and all other supervisory standards. We are going to see deregulation. The United Kingdom is likely to start racing to the bottom in a desperate attempt to minimize the amount of losses the city takes when it exits the EU and is out there on its own. Instead of being Singapore on the Thames, though, it will, of course, become Cayman Islands on the Thames. The German-led European system may improve through the single supervisory mechanism, but we still live in a world where thousands of German Sparkassen had their bad banks paid for by Greek and Irish savers. So, this is not a world in which we should expect the power of regulation to be very strong. That doesn't mean we immediately get a terrible world outcome. Sometimes it is better to be lucky than to be smart. In fact, most times it is better to be lucky than to be smart. A pattern that I've never documented properly, and someone more clever will no doubt do so, but if you go through the list of financial crises evolved through the years, you will find that, whether it's the Reinhard Rogoff or the updated IMF, or pick your data set, there's actually negative autocorrelation in financial crises. And not only is there negative autocorrelation, it's not the toothpaste tube that you squeeze one and it pops up again. It's you squeeze the toothpaste tube and it comes out, and then there's nothing left in the tube. But additionally, the business cycle tends to be very low vol, and you have an extended recovery once you've gotten a lot of leverage out of the system and people have a lot of fear. And this is what we saw in Japan and Canada in the 90s after their own financial crises, so I'm not as surprised by what happens now. So, there are still very real mysteries about the financial system. In particular, the inability to get somehow long-term infrastructure projects funded, whether by private or public means, even though everybody insists we're short of safe assets and everybody wants returns. That, for example, would be an interesting concept to think about. But just to think that we're going to end up with a financial system that doesn't have to worry about extreme volatility. I'm going to skip over points about central banking. We can get back to those. Jingdong, Vice President Hua, did some nice work on terms of the importance of financial technology and innovation as a transformation for provision of benefits to the poor and raising the poor. And there I agree to a point. I think if you do manage to get the ID system in India working such that people do get their benefits, or in Kenya or wherever, directly on a card without them having to pay the middle person and get ripped off and avoid corruption, that is a major advance. That is, in economics terms, however, a one-time efficiency gain. You're basically removing, and it's very important in human terms, okay? It is very important in human terms. It is far more important than anything else the rest of us will probably ever do. But in terms of effect on the financial system, on financial stability, on financial innovation, on GDP growth, on all these things, you are essentially removing a deadweight loss, which is nice. And it's a deadweight loss being removed for the poorest people, which is extra nice. But for purposes of this conference and this discussion, it doesn't really change anything. The fundamental problem remains, and this is the flip side of, in my view, of Thomas's very interesting research, which you should read, about the costs of financial intermediation, which is they're overcharging, it's too expensive, and yet nobody makes a profit. Or at least nobody makes a profit unless they're doing things that are unsustainable or involve fraud. There is no sustainable profit-making model on the whole, on average, for banking systems at the moment. And that has not been true for a long time. And if you look at some of the work the IMF Financial Capital Markets Group has done under Jose Vinales and now under Tobias Adrian, another New York Fed alum, it's very clear that they're sounding warnings about the fact that, for example, many European banks cannot make a profit. We have overcapacity. We would have to reduce the number of European banks in order for them to be profitable. And so to me, the biggest potential problem coming out of financial innovation is that actually if we do get more efficient intermediation, what remains of what little bit of legitimate profit these companies make will go to zero. And so that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it should happen to any industry when technology changes it. That's fine. But as a transitional dynamic, that's a little worrisome. So let me go to two hopes and a fear in my remaining 90 seconds. I have one hope that comes out of that issue of profitability going away and financial innovation and some of the issues, again, that Thomas raised about market power. I really do like the utilities model for banking and for a number of other financial services. I realize it's always supposed to be a sign of lack of economic sophistication or lack of knowledge of obscure Scottish history that you don't, that if you believe in this. But you know, the arguments for utility and the de facto utilities like the Japanese postal savings system, and for that matter, the Sparkassen in Germany, actually serve a lot of purposes. And so my hope is that if we do get some positive change, it will be more and more towards the utility model, at least for basic consumer financial services. The second thing is, I have a hope that because of the causes of the crisis and something to which financial innovation is not going to change much, despite the existence now of Quicken Mortgage, you can press a button on your phone and get a mortgage, is that real estate financing will fundamentally change in the years ahead. As our colleagues from Japan know exceedingly well, the worst financial crises are when you have an overhang of real estate that is illiquid and you cannot get rid of. Rick Mishkin here at Columbia did some seminal work with Mike Bordo's colleague at Rutgers. I'm sorry, Mike, his name is slipping me. Is it White? On how real estate crises were the fundamental cause of most of the worst downturns in the U.S. history. I don't think that's going away. And again, financial innovation cannot change that because that's fundamentally a Lemons information asymmetry problem. It's fundamentally a locational problem. And so I view that as where the big issue is. Finally, fear. And I will branch out briefly, as Peter and Secretary Liu and others did before me today, on the political side, even though I defer to some of the people on the two previous panel who know it better. I think, again, I would say the word to recognize is economic nationalism for this purpose, not populism. And, you know, I think it's important to remember, and here I differ a little bit from my friend Peter, that, yeah, us economists shouldn't be, or us insiders from the East Coast, should not be dismissive of the concerns of people with finance, but we should also recognize that people vote and agitate for reasons that may not have anything to do with economics, or for that matter, may have to do with relative status rather than actual economic efficiency. And I know you don't deny that. But just to say that if the economic nationalism continues, I don't have the sort of classical fear of populism that this leads to hyperinflation or massive redistribution. I have the fear of populism that the fear of economic nationalism that it overdoes the too big to fail national champions concentration of banking even further. And so I would just mention the notion of Deutsche Bank, not about its current travails, although those are well known to everyone in this room, but about its history. So Deutsche Bank was originally one of the banks in Germany that came out of the late 19th century, but which also was considered a Jewish bank because of the people on its board. And of course that was natural because only Jews were doing finance in Europe for a long period for various legal and religious reasons. But of course the Nazis got rid of the Jews on the Deutsche Bank board and everywhere else. But Deutsche Bank kept going. And the war came and went, and we had Reconstruction, and Deutsche Bank kept going. And it became the holding company for a bunch of other banks. And like certain American banks I could name, it was overexposed in every financial crisis of the last 40 years because it's too big to fail and it felt it should be global, and it kept going. And so, all joking aside, if we want to worry about economic nationalism, the people in the banks are not the ones you need to worry about. They're not going anywhere. Thank you.
So thank you all very much. I have a question that I think every one of you touched on, and I'm either directly or indirectly. Is the bigger problem in financial services too much fragmentation or too much concentration?
I mean, let me do a mea culpa so I can be made fun of and then the others can go in. So about 10, 12 years ago, I gave a talk at the Inter-American Development Bank with some stupid title like Bigger Banks, Fewer Crises. That should be a laugh line, okay?
Yes.
You know, it's so there was, I think, I will take my own responsibility for saying something that proved so stupid. But, I mean, I think it reflected the idea that, you know, if you have major institutions that are well diversified and held to international standards, and in the particular U.S. system, but in other countries, that means they're regulated or supervised by the central bank rather than some more political, local, or smaller regulator. They should be okay. And of course, the Swiss government lives this the Swiss central bank lives this every day. They have two enormous institutions. They have publicly admitted they can't get rid of those institutions. And so in the spirit of Mark Twain, they put all their eggs in one basket and watch that basket. And so I don't think there's a simple answer to the question you raised, Trish, although maybe it's just I was stupid. But I think one thing which I would say is, if some of the trends I pointed to about lack of profitability and some of the work that many other people in this room and elsewhere have done on Too Big to Fail are right, then that still pushes you more towards the utility model rather than a fragmented model. One more sentence and then I'll shut up. On the other hand, one has to acknowledge, and I've made this argument more recently, that one of the reasons Germany and US came out of the financial crisis in terms of the persistence of the shock being less than, say, the UK or Japan in its time is they had more diversified financial systems. And so you got rid of the spare tire, but you had many other little wheels you could put on. And many people have spoken about the need for diversity in financial systems, so that may be the better thing to focus on than fragmentation versus concentration. Maybe that's my...
So the thing is, you could have you don't need a lot of fragmentation to have a lot of competition. So to me, it's like that's the dimension you want to focus on. And do you have enough competition? And then it depends on which market you're looking at. Clearly, some markets you do, some markets you don't. So that's the way I would frame it. I think it's also, but maybe you can hear something more precise about that. I think it plays out differently today in emerging markets and in you know, like developed economies. And clearly in Europe, there's a specific issue of perhaps some of these banks should be merged. But if you have cross-border merger in Europe, I think it would be a good thing. It wouldn't decrease competition.
So, anybody else?
Yes.
Dave.
Go ahead.
So let me share my impression on poor countries. So in sub-Saharan Africa, banks are actually quite powerful because they don't have capital market. Banks are all they have. But relative to GDP, when you have banks at 5, 10, 20% of GDP, a capital market at 0% or 1% of GDP, one could argue that you need to grow all of the sectors. But there is a motivation by the banks to keep all the financing to themselves, or they don't have incentive to see other markets grow. So this is where policy intervention would be very important, because a country needs a diversified financial services. And I agree with Adams. If we can say to banks, you are a public utility because your job is the financial safety for the country, then let capital market handle more risky intermediation between savings, extra savings that can go to, you know, project finance or venture capital. So that would be my thing. Again, on the public utility, one could even argue that as water, electricity utilities aren't basic financial services utilities that should reach everyone. And this, obviously, having a unique ID is important. I think there are over $1 billion people that have no IDs. This is where what India is doing in a unique ID is so significant, because by having a unique ID, the government actually saved billions of dollars of fraud, among many other benefits. So,
Trish, your question's a great one. I think the answer is yes. That's because I like to approach the problem of efficiency in the financial system by saying it can't possibly be efficient. Look how much money's being made. But acknowledging it has a slight and powerful tendency toward efficiency. and then we get disruptions along the way. But those of us who went to law school and have that cross to bear know about the town with one lawyer that has no legal business, and the town with two lawyers has lots of legal business. And like medicine and law, finance has the opportunity that the more of it there is, the more of it there can be. Which Keynes talked about being ill done if it's a casino. But I just want to point out, we're all struggling with and Adam posed it, I don't know if he saw it as a struggle. We like the utility model, but not the national champion, and there lies the dilemma.
Absolutely.
We know there's something inefficient about a utility that worries us. We like that, we think we can control it, and we don't like it. Now, I think that in finance that gets us into trouble because we don't recognize how subtle the differences in political economy are. So the Canadians can run a regulated oligopoly in their financial sector, and it looks more stable in a crisis. And we all say, see, we don't have to worry about financial stability. We could do it like the Canadians. But we can't in this country. Politically, we're incapable of putting a ring around a few big banks and saying we're going to regulate their rate of return and keep them stable and profitable. I mean, we could get away with that to save our lives here, given the history of Andrew Jackson. And those subtleties in political economy haunt us.
Yes, Jeff.
Could somebody tell me why, at a time when deposits yield nothing, credit card rates are 15% for, you know, a borrower with a credit score of 850 and 24%, and go up from there, right? In other words, if the financial sector is so competitive, how can it possibly be the case that the minimum spread on a zero-risk consumer credit card is 15%?
I'm not sure this is the panel of people telling you the financial sector is so competitive, for what it's worth.
Yeah, I don't think we
have to. No, go ahead. Please.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Talk to us.
Just to be fair, well, a credit card is one obvious example. We know what happens, which is poor people pay for rich people. That's obvious. So, like, nobody's paying that interest unless they have to, or they're not sophisticated enough to pay their balances on time. So this is like, it's just a big negative redistribution. Now, why? So then, to me, it begs two questions about competition in finance. What does competition in finance play out differently than in other industries? And there, I think we have to be fair. It could just be that the regulations are messed up. I mean, it's not just that bankers are evil. I think the regulations might be also particularly inefficient in finance for many reasons. So I think that has to be part of the equation. We can't just assume that this is the failure of the private sector. I think the regulations are pretty bad. The fact that there is no entry in many of these industries because you can't take over a bank. The fact that, why is it that Apple and Amazon never applied for a banking license, even though they would probably do it very efficiently? Well, I think there's a pretty clear reason. So I think it's not just like private sector failure. The one part where there is clearly private sector failure is the fact that people's expectation and people's understanding of the financial system is such that it creates more room for private firms to exploit these biases. I mean, that happens in every industry, in hotels, they all try to exploit the behavioral biases we have. Just in finance, it's stronger because there's more money involved. So you're willing to pay for subjective safety, which is not really there, and you shouldn't pay for. And so I think that's the specific part about finance.
Can I just say one word? That is, fintech companies are trying to see whether they could disrupt this industry. I think in the US you have Lending Club, Prosper, SoFi, saying the consumer financing space, the margins are so high, and through a fintech, they can reduce their cost while using additional data points to ascertain the credit quality, and hopefully, but that's only, if my memory is right, 2 or 3% of the total credit to consumer. But just imagine if that goes to 10, 20, 30%, probably the cost will come down. But the traditional credit card don't have an incentive to themselves reduce it.
Could I just add a different kind of note of caution? I mean, joined the New York Fed, I guess, 1985, and the New York Fed was still just finishing working on all the technological innovations that got us from paper to electronics. 2016-17 is not the first time we've had a lot of technology applied to finance.
Right.
And that margin Thomas showed us has been pretty flat. I mean, it's been pretty constant.
Yep.
So you would have thought we could have gotten some more competition before now, given the amount of technology dollars we've thrown at finance, and it hasn't happened.
It brings me back to something actually that Gil Mendoza said earlier today about the fact that the history here is that a huge amount of the technological innovation happened inside a pretty concentrated industry to begin with, which does, the economist in me sort of stands up and says, okay, well, that actually explains some, that may explain a bit of that right there. Yes, Ben.
Well, at the risk of beating what may be a dead horse, at least with this panel, as someone who lives in the private sector and has been around for a number of the innovations cycles in technology, it feels really, really competitive, and it feels like it's getting incredibly competitive. And the availability of data and the ability to mine data, the availability for consumers to see data, the ability to have price comparison, certainly in the developed markets. It doesn't, the world I work in doesn't sound like the one you guys are describing, where prices are collapsing, and the only way to survive is through the economies of scales and becoming hyper efficient. So I know you've sort of defined yourself mostly as thinking that it's not so competitive, but if you're up to it, I take my challenge.
Sure. First off, I want to suggest that the challenge you make is a very common one made by anyone in the private sector in the advanced economies today. You hear all the time, not just in banking or investment banking or financial trading, you hear from people in steel production, people in auto industry, people in energy industry, people in accounting. I hear it all the time of people saying, don't you understand? Competition is so incredible right now. Globalization has brought us competition. Technology is driving things forward. God, life is tough. And then you have the cold-hearted reality that the number of new entrants, not just in this field, but in other fields, is way down in every major economy. Profit share of the economy is way up in every major share of the economy. Stock market valuations are up. I'm not going to say they're undervalued or overvalued. In fact, I think they're probably roughly fairly valued, because for all the talk about competition, in industry after industry, you have incumbent firms making very large profits and going nowhere. And so no matter how many times private sector people feel that in their everyday lives, I think that's more a question of the degree to which everyone who isn't at the very top of corporations is starting to suffer like normal workers and be under enormous pressure for performance and uncertainty about their own jobs. And that conveys into your mindset. But the reality at the corporate level is that companies are making huge profits. And the few that don't, we just saw enormous, horrible hit to earnings in the earnings report for General Electric today. General Electric isn't going out of business. General Electric isn't going anywhere. Their CEO just turned over after, I believe, 16 years in the job. So, no matter how many times one says that, it just doesn't conform with reality on average.
I want to agree with Ben, having worked with Ben closely. I think there's a tendency toward efficiency, which is the form of competition within financial services. But the financial services share of the total economy, as Thomas showed, is really constant. It's not like it's squeezing out and making financial services more efficient relative to the rest of what's going on.
Okay. I think Wilson was next.
Thank you. I want to react to a couple of comments that Adam mentioned. One was his comment about herding, and I do think that's going to be one of the interesting things to watch, because I do think we have sacrificed diversity at the altar of intensive supervision. We don't have big investment banks in the U.S. anymore. Everything is a regulated bank, And I think around the world, the convergence of financial models is something that has changed the world from what it was 10 years ago when you had, I think, a more diverse zoo to a much more similar zoo. And that is something that worries me longer term. The second thing was your laugh line, which I didn't laugh at because I actually thought the old Adam Posner was correct. I've heard the governor of the Bank of Spain, for example, in 2012 say, "Thank God for big banks." In Spain, they were the only ones diversified enough to get through the local real estate crisis. Senator Glass said that in the 1930s. And when I was CRO of one of those gigantic Swiss institutions, the diversity of our business lines was hugely important. So I do think it leads to safe banking. The question that it begs is too big to fail. And that's one that I think we've ignored a lot in this conversation, but we have changed fundamentally in the last 10 years through a lot of good work led by Paul Tucker and the Financial Stability Board. We now have $1.5 trillion of bank rescue funds in the form of TLAC that can be used, I think, efficiently today for probably over half of the GSIBs. So I think you've got another way to crack that problem that's fundamentally different than what we've had before. I think that changes discussions around nationalism, and I think it changes a lot of these other discussions in a much more positive way. So I think it is important to recognize that there have been a couple of pretty fundamental things that have been slid to a different place in the banking system.
Can I just briefly respond? On the first point about diversity, I know I'm glad to hear you say that, and I didn't mean that as a throwaway. As I said, I've argued on the point about comparative financial systems, and so I'm very glad to hear you say that. In terms of my non-laugh line and why, I know you weren't trying to rescue me, you were trying to rescue a good intellectual concept, and I made it too simple. I mean, the reality is you can die through too much bank fragmentation in small banks, you can die through big banks. I mean, and you know that. Right, so actually, if you look at the early days of the Japanese financial crisis, again, I obviously can be corrected, but you look at the Jusen, small credit institutions, you look at the many banks that had a bad model, and the Japanese banking system became much safer when that was consolidated. So it would be nice if someone clever could do some econometric thing that showed you there was a U shape and there was some optimal degree. But I think, similar to Peter, there's a lot of subtleties at a nation-by-nation basis, or economy by economy, not nation-by-nation basis, that mean you're not going to get a simple relationship. But you're right to correct me. The one thing I would say, last thing I would say, though, on the Spanish example and all that, you're absolutely right. So in Spain and in Italy, it's primarily been the credit unions, the Caixas, the small banks, the Monte dei Paschis, the Sienas, and the small banks. This has been the source of the problem. But on the other hand, I think what you said up front about we've sort of sacrificed diversity for very intensive supervision is something to really think about. Because again, I have huge regard for the Swiss system and what they did with UBS in terms of demanding a lot from it for its rescue and being very stringent with it. But it cuts both ways. So I think the too big to fail thing isn't clear. So to give another Spanish example, as many people may have noticed in the Catalonia dispute at the moment, several Spanish banks moved their headquarters, their domicile, from Catalonia to a part of Spain that wasn't going to secede. And from a global economic perspective, from the assumption that Catalonia would get back into the single supervisory mechanism, not clear why they should do that. If, however, you believe you're a too big to fail bank, or your concern is having good relations with the institutions that can bail you out, then you want to be somewhere close to the Spanish government and not tied to the Catalonian government. So TLAC is important. There is progress. I'm not denying any of that. And I know you're not denying the opposite, just to say it's not clear. It's not clear.
I think Fernando was next, and then Steve. Why don't we take?
My question is relatively simple, but let me just make a statement. As we all know, the most valuable financial institutions in the world today are universal banks that combine retail and wholesale. JP Morgan Chase, B of A, Merrill Lynch is worth 3 times Goldman or Morgan Stanley, and Goldman is trying to do something in retail. At the same time, we have an Eurozone, and we're talking about the financial system in 2025. Everybody worried about liquidity and funding, and a name was mentioned here, Deutsche Bank, that grew acquiring wholesale banks, betting on it tremendously, leveraging strongly, and then facing the challenge it has today. In opinion of the panel, do you see, and borrowing from Tricia's comment, concentration versus competition, but do you see a phenomenon of further concentration or consolidation in Europe with movements like a Deutsche Bank that does not have a lot of cheap funding in Europe, merging, being acquired, merge of equals, you call it, with UniCredit or Intesa? Or are we, as it was discussed earlier today, in this process of national roots and other political challenges, not foreseeing that environment? A couple of years ago, if I were asked this question, I'd say, yes, there is, there are the national barriers, but there will be a natural process of further consolidation in Europe so that we would have more BNP Paribas in Europe. So that's the question. I don't have a clear view on it as we speak.
Tricia, do you want to take a couple of questions, or go one?
Yeah, why don't we take another one? Steve, why don't you go ahead? Because we should end on time. It's Friday afternoon.
Thanks. So,
Oh, Paul has a question too.
I just want to go back to the topic of consumer lending, and specifically, there's we heard reference to some of the fintech players in online lending, marketplace lending, peer-to-peer lending, call it what you want. And I'm wondering what you guys each think about the debate that's going on as to how much of what's generating growth in this area is true efficiency gains, as perhaps we've heard some reference to, and how much of it is cream skimming and regulatory arbitrage. And in light of that, of your answer to that, what do you think the regulatory policy should be? Again, taking into account the fact that there are many countries where this is happening, and potentially competition across countries on the regulatory front.
Mm-hmm. Who wants to go first? Thomas?
Well, so clearly in terms of bank consolidation, I think Europe should play out differently from the rest of the world. And so so in my mind, there's a strong case for saying that we should have more cross-border bank mergers within the Eurozone. So we have too many banks, and I would be much happier if we solve that problem by merging across border than within border. I think that's, to me, it's obvious. And in fact, that's the only thing that's consistent with the true idea of the banking union. Now, whether we're going to do it, at this point, of course, is highly political. But I think I would say there's a good shot. I think it's definitely, I'm cautiously optimistic on that. Then, for the whole debate about concentration versus efficiency, I think the fair reading of the data is that it doesn't really matter. There's just no obvious correlation between fragmentation of the banking system and safety of the banking system. It's kind of flat, actually. I think there is some evidence. It's not overwhelming. There's some evidence that it's better to have a bond market and a banking system.
Exactly.
I think there's some evidence for that, especially it's got a little bit stronger recently. So I think that's the case we want to make. So in that case, I would say the more important thing is making sure that the landscape remains competitive, but that doesn't mean it has to be competitive within banking. It could just be that you give them an outside option for both actually for consumers and for firms to get funding otherwise. Or in other words, if you think about it, why is it that the airline industry is so much better in Europe than in the US today? Well, clearly it's a lot cheaper and more competitive. But part of it is because they have to compete with the trains. It's not only, we have a much less concentrated airline industry in Europe. in itself. So that's better. But also, on most of the lines, they compete with trains. So I think so that's my metaphor. So if you think about finance, same thing. You just want to make sure people have an alternative to the traditional commercial bank for getting their loans or for their funding. And Stephen's question, I think, is exactly the right one. In fact, I think you probably know more than us about that. So what's your take on it? My sense is that right now the jury is still out because there is, as far as I understand, there is some clear examples where the algorithms that people use for screening are getting better, and they are getting better thanks to new players. So I think there's evidence of that. On the other hand, there's plenty of evidence that, at least initially, they are viable because they don't have the heavier regulation that the banks have. So there is some regulatory arbitrage. So I would cast that more into the. So the way I would think about it personally is more a question of what is the optimal design of a sandbox, and what is the meaning of level playing field in finance. So in finance, because of too big to fail subsidies, level playing field cannot be applied the same rules. That would not be the right way to think about it. So clearly you want to give them a break at the beginning. And then the tricky question is, when do you graduate from the sandbox? And I think that's where the debate is in the UK as well, and to me that's the right way to and I don't think we know the answer to that one yet.
Yeah, sure.
So can I answer the second one? On universal banks, I'm not a economist or central banker. The only observation I would say is that as a bond issuer, right after the global financial crisis, those who are universal bank that can rely on a stronger balance sheet certainly won out. So that's, but my curiosity is that when the term structure of interest rate go back to normal, what's going to happen? There, I think, might be a new reshuffle. So that's my comment. On the consumer lending, my observation is this, that a single business line could not interrupt a tradition, at least in the US, that has already been established. So in the US, we still write checks. You know, the ACH system works well. Now, it is in China and developing countries where it is not a single line. It is the new ecosystem of e-commerce, from payment, logistics, settlement, where by a cell phone, you can do everything together, where the volume of transaction, I understand, in the Chinese ecosystem is 70, 80 times bigger than the US, because US, in spite of Amazon being on the e-commerce, they relied on the traditional credit card as the essential settlement. So it's very different than in the emerging market. So I'm curious to see 7 years later, 2025, whether there will be an ecosystem created where without brick and mortar, it's not only just payment or consumer lending, it is SME lending. It is using big data that give those fintech companies a cutting edge that the traditional ones don't have. So that should be quite interesting.
So, Paul, last question? No, okay. Sorry. Anybody else? Good. We're done. 5 minutes early. Lovely. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you all for coming.